Right, guys, I am going to start recording this. You'll hear something soon. Okay, guys, I am going to begin. Let me share my screen. I will show you the PowerPoints, and we will go through everything here. Let's see. Get set up. Okay, so I'm going to get started, guys. Welcome. All right, to the live symposium and Q&A. We will go over principles of cycle design. We'll discuss two worked examples. We'll go through the first worked example that we will go through will be for a not a bodybuilder, a male model, and the second will be for a female wellness competitor. So, principles of cycle design. Thank you all for coming. This is August 31st, and it is 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So, the sections that we will discuss today are as follows. So, the items to the left that are marked by arrows are the factors that will be considered at all steps of individualization, compound selection, initial dosing, and titration. And additional factors where pertinent will be described. The items numbered are the sections that we will discuss and review, working back through steps 1 through 5 for each of our two worked examples. So we're going to discuss individualization, compound selection, dosing, initial and titration, increasing or in some cases decreasing dose. We'll then discuss efficacy, dose response, tolerability, monitoring, efficacy versus tolerability. Monitoring is like long-term monitoring of blood work parameters, as well as like blood pressure monitoring, things like that you want to keep an eye on. We'll discuss push factors versus pull factors for how aggressive or risk averse you might be in your cycle design, dosing, compound selection. And then we will apply those in two examples. So we'll discuss combination strategies, synergy, complementary, and additive combination strategies. And then we will go through a Q&A where I will open it up to any questions that you guys might have as well. Okay, so first worked example, we'll analyze cycle design for a 26-year-old male model who has a photo shoot in 8 weeks. He will not blast and cruise, and he must maintain his above average but not bodybuilder level muscle mass after the cycle. The second worked example will analyze cycle design for a 26-year-old female NPC wellness competitor with realistic aspirations of attaining a pro card within the next 4 months, who has her next show in 16 weeks. And after applying these two worked examples, we'll discuss Q&A live. So, okay, so first step that we will take is a workflow individualization. And this is basically what you're looking at here. Individualization of compound, i.e. selection, and dose, initial, and the rate of increase or decrease depends on a risk tolerance assessment of discrete push and pull factors for each case, for each person. Push factors are those that beckon for more risk, and pull factors are those that beckon for less risk. Risk tolerance for each individual depends on these dependencies here on the right. So age, sex, female, male at birth, what we look at, training status, okay, whether they're advanced, intermediate, novice, or very advanced. Body composition, the most important value that we care about are fat-free mass index and body fat percentage. And then we also look at familial cardiovascular disease history to decide whether it's something that we need to be very careful with when dosing and selecting compounds. So, assessing risk tolerance. This is how it's done. To assess risk tolerance, I rely on a few proprietary materials that I have built that include an individualized cardiovascular disease risk profile, an objective-oriented planning and monitoring of body composition, and basic health self-monitoring for long-term AAS users. Those that I coach are familiar with these materials, but I'm going to give you a lot of that without getting into too much detail. But here is what we will discuss. Familial history of thromboembolic or fatal cardiovascular disease risk is a huge pull factor. If somebody has a grandparent or an uncle who has heart disease or who has had a stroke, especially at an early age, that's going to make us use a more risk averse approach in selecting compounds as well as dosing. If they have an elevated steps 1 through 5 for each of our 2 worked examples. So we're going to discuss individualization, compound selection, dosing, initial and titration, increasing or in some cases decreasing dose. We'll then discuss efficacy, dose response, tolerability, monitoring, efficacy versus tolerability. Monitoring is like long-term monitoring of blood work parameters as well as like blood pressure monitoring, things like that you want to keep an eye on. We'll discuss push factors versus pull factors for how aggressive or risk averse you might be in your cycle design, dosing, compound selection. And then we will apply those in 2 examples. So we'll discuss combination strategies, synergy, complementary, and additive combination strategies. And then we will go through a Q&A where I will open it up to any questions that you guys might have as well. Okay, so first worked example, we'll analyze cycle design for a 26-year-old male model who has a photo shoot in 8 weeks. He will not blast and cruise, and he must maintain his above average but not bodybuilder level muscle mass after the cycle. The second worked example will analyze cycle design for a 26-year-old female NPC wellness competitor with realistic aspirations of attaining a pro card within the next 4 months, who has her next show in 16 weeks. And after applying these 2 worked examples, we'll discuss Q&A live. So, okay, so first step that we will take is a workflow individualization. And this is basically what you're looking at here. Individualization of compound, i.e. selection, and dose initial, and the rate of increase or decrease depends on a risk tolerance assessment of discrete push and pull factors for each case, for each person. Push factors are those that beckon for more risk, and pull factors are those that beckon for less risk. Risk tolerance for each individual depends on these dependencies here on the right. So age, sex, female, male at birth, what we look at, training status, okay, whether they're advanced, intermediate, novice, or very advanced. Body composition, the most important value that we care about are fat-free mass index and body fat percentage. And then we also look at familial cardiovascular disease history to decide whether it's something that we need to be very careful with when dosing and selecting compounds. So assessing risk tolerance, this is how it's done. To assess risk tolerance, I rely on a few proprietary materials that I have built that include an individualized cardiovascular disease risk profile, an objective-oriented planning and monitoring of body composition, and basic health self-monitoring for long-term AAS users. Those that I coach are familiar with these materials, but I'm going to give you a lot of that without getting into too much detail. But here is what we will discuss. Familial history of thromboembolic or fatal cardiovascular disease risk is a huge pull factor. If somebody has a grandparent or an uncle who has heart disease or who has had a stroke, especially at an early age, that's going to make us use a more risk averse approach in selecting compounds as well as dosing. If they have an elevated CVD risk profile individually, right? So the things that we would look at there would be like lipids, okay, particularly ApoB and ApoA1. And then another huge pull factor is just being female, because the female reproductive system and hypothalamo-gonadal axis is just so much less resilient to male sex hormones, those that are based on testosterone, than a man's is. Push factors, things that will make us be more aggressive and take more risk, would be if they're young, so, under 30 years old. Their training status, fat-free mass index, if that's high, if that's like above 27 kg over meter squared, if they derive an income from their physique or might reasonably be able to do so within 18 months, that's going to be a reason to push more aggressively. If they have average or below CVD risks according to their own blood work, then that's going to be a push factor to be more aggressive. adherence to the basic health self-monitoring guide. This is something that I give out to my clients. Basically, I'll describe it to you. It's like, keeping up on your blood work, doing annual echocardiograms, doing annual liver ultrasounds if you use oral 17AAs, just basically taking care of your health and looking at the correct blood work parameters, the most vital ones on a routine basis. Okay, so let's move on. So that's assessing risk tolerance, very important. So the process of compound selection and dosing contains 3 steps. First, at the base are the considerations that are weighed in selecting compound. So sex, for example, if the individual is female, is a paramount consideration. We have to be more risk averse, like I said, because females' fertility, which is very important to women, if they want to have a child, the female reproductive hormones like estrogen and progesterone are just particularly sensitive to androgens, whereas the male system is more resilient in this regard because it is a male system. The objective or overarching goal that we are aiming at a particular time is either cutting, recomp, or bulking. Risk tolerance, we're going to weigh those push versus pull factors. That's for selecting the compound, right? Initial dose is going to be dependent, especially on whether we're dealing with a female or a male. So more androgenic, compounds, we want to use very low doses if you even use them. For females, we might prefer like oral turinabol, or we might prefer Anavar or Winstrol. Those are attenuated androgens. And then when setting the dose, we're going to start very, very low, especially for a new user without experience, gradually ramp things up. For a female especially. Training status is very important for setting the initial dose. Somebody who's very advanced, somebody who is very strong and has a lot of muscle mass that ties into the FFMI, fat-free mass index, you're going to set the initial dose much higher. Risk tolerance, again, is always weighed pull versus push factors. Then dose titration. Titrate dose up or even occasionally down, depending on tolerability. Efficacy, which is dose response. Time-bounded objective, show date, for example, how long we have. Okay. So monitoring, we're going to be trading off efficacy versus tolerability when doing our long-term monitoring, which is looking again at blood work parameters, values, and things like blood pressure. So it's always balancing, a weighing, a trading off of efficacy versus tolerability. So for efficacy with androgens and with growth factors, we're looking at changes to lean body mass, changes to fat mass, and changes to strength. Always balancing that against tolerability factors. These include masculinization, cardiovascular disease parameters, blood work parameters, toxicity, anger and hostility, appetite and hunger, fertility and endogenous testosterone, or in the case of females, estrogens and progesterone, and then just miscellaneous sexual health as well. And when we're looking at tolerability, things that we might specifically look for like CVD parameters or like blood pressure. For masculinization, for women, we might use a voice pitch analyzer. This changes to voice pitch dysphonia is a rapid non-genomic effect. So that would be the soonest indicator of masculinization, would be to look at voice pitch. Toxicity symptoms, you'd look for like, are they feeling weak? Are they nauseous? Are their stools loose? Are they reporting anything like that to you? That would be an indication. Anger and hostility, I have a questionnaire that I give. Appetite, hunger, same, but those are pretty, how hungry are you? Is it interfering with training, performance in the gym, etc.? Fertility and endogenous T, you're really weighing whether the risks and how important it is to that person to maintain their fertility. Are they going to cycle off? Are they going to blast a cruise? And the miscellaneous sexual wellness is really just like, are they able to perform? Are they reporting to you? If they're reporting anything to you about sexual health, right, it's a concern. So in the case of somebody who is not able to maintain an erection, you want to look at that. So that is something that is affected by androgens, especially DECA. All right, so optimization of efficacy and tolerability, right? So you're always trading off efficacy versus tolerability in your dosing and compound selection. And we're always trying to utilize synergistic combinations. Here's a continuum from, the additive, through complementary, through synergistic types. So the favorable combinations that we have can be grouped into those that are synergistic, meaning greater than additive. So think 1 + 1 is greater than 2. Complementary are those combinations that are opposite, such that combination yields a middling out of behavior. Think 1 + -1 = 0. Or merely additive combinations, which is basically everything else. 1 + 1 = 2. Synergistic combinations are those that bring about a biological effect, for example, muscle accrual. That's the result of multiple mechanisms, for example, anti-catabolism and protein synthesis, and or pathways, for example, muscle ring finger 1, estrogen 1, versus glucocorticoid receptor expression, IGF-1 activity, by different mechanisms and or pathways, resulting in a greater than additive effect. Total AAS dose does not reflect effects where synergistic combinations are used. So that's what you have to understand. So like, whereas dose increases curvilinearly with changes to lean body mass, that's not the case when you rely more on synergistic combinations, because synergistic combinations combine greater than additively. So total AAS dose, like I said, does not reflect those effects. A higher AAS number, right, nor compounds that you use, if they are synergistic, are actually less harmful and healthier than just ramping up total AAS dose of merely additive AAS combinations, where it is used to reduce total AAS dose. So you rely on synergy always where possible to reduce dose. And that is borne out by the Harlem trial data, by the way. So there was a positive correlation between AAS weekly dose and left ventricular mass, showing that more compounds that were used, implying they were synergistic, actually showed less harm to the left ventricle of the heart. The number of AAS used definitely should always be leveraged synergy when you're combining things. You don't want to have just high doses of things if you don't have to, you'd rather do, basically, let me put it this way, you'd rather do 75 milligrams of tren and 250 milligrams of testosterone than 750 milligrams of testosterone if the outcome is recomp in 8 weeks. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. Okay. So the complementary combinations are those for which each effect acts in opposition to each other, such that their combination results in a middling out of behavior. So for example, aromatizable and non-aromatizable androgen combined appropriately will result in neither net anti-estrogenic nor estrogenic effects, such that tolerability is maintained. So for example, combination of AAS to modulate the comfort of joints, dry plus wet, equals robust, if you think, for example, combining winstrol and anadrol. Additive combinations are the remainder, everything else. These are the result of similar effects between AAS acting via the same mechanisms or pathways. Total dose, milligram per week, would be linear when you're combining additive combinations. So important factors that affect total AAS dose, milligram per week, as a proxy for systemic or tissue level effects. Basically, you're looking at AR regulation factors like AAS dose, whether they increase AR number, that kind of thing. So let's move on to the next slide here. All right, so let's go through a worked example. So the first case that I want to talk about is this male model, okay, who derives an income from his physique. He is a healthy 26-year-old man. He's 10% body fat, 25 kg per meter squared FFMI, which is, pretty muscular. It's not like bodybuilder level, but he's pretty lean. He's pretty jacked. Derives an income from his physique already. He's a model. He does some acting. And his principal objective is recomp, right? So recomp means he wants to increase fat-free mass and decrease fat mass for a photo shoot. And he has 8 weeks to do this. He's totally unwilling to blast and cruise. So he therefore wants to maximally maintain his fat-free mass, his skeletal muscle, and be able to cycle off and still have that muscle after the completion of the course. So he has no accessibility to HCG or HMG, that would otherwise maintain spermato and steroidogenesis for him. And he has an absolute unwillingness and or intolerability for fluid retention from growth factors. So he's not going to use any GH or anything. The assumptions here are that the suppressive effects on his fertility and on his T production, endogenous T, are a product of time and dose. And like I've been telling you, we should always rely on synergy to reduce dose. Total exogenous AAS washout is not necessary to remove the stressors to HPG axes functioning, exerting a permissive effect on his restoration of endogenous T and fertility. These are our assumptions, and modest concentrations arising out of doses and basically activity, half-life. If we allow the compounds that are cleared quickly to clear out and then use less suppressive compounds after, it will be essentially like cycling off, but stepping down in our suppression. Okay, so the worked example here is our practical design. Okay, so the objective is recomp with minimal suppressive effects on the T production for this person. So therefore, we want to optimize his fertility and endogenous T. We're always going to be balancing efficacy versus tolerability. Okay. Compound selections and doses that we will use. Compounds are going to be testosterone, trenbolone, asterone, anavar. We're going to use these leveraging synergy to reduce dose so that he doesn't suppress himself using high doses, especially if something like testosterone is pretty suppressive. We're going to use propionate, we're going to use acetate, okay, and we're going to use VAR and anavar, which is pretty rapid acting and clears out quickly. I'll describe to you why we combine these and why they are synergistic. So anavar, right, is a 5-alpha androsten 3-one, which is non-aromatizable and non-5-alpha reducible. Its particular property is hepatic ketosis. Okay. So let's go back to the slide. I'll just tell you. Okay. So this is the time course that we're going to use. The time course is going to be a 6+2 design, right? So this guy has 8 weeks to get to his goal. Did we go through that last slide? Yeah. Okay. All right, so the time course is going to be 6+2. We're going to set the initial 6 weeks for maximal muscle anabolism. We're going to use doses and compounds that are synergistic and potent in the beginning with minimal suppression that can be ameliorated by basically putting them first and using short-acting esters that will allow us to step down in the suppression on the last 2 weeks using less androgenic compounds, less suppressive compounds. So weeks 1 through 6, we're going to use short esters, we're going to use testosterone, we're going to use trenbolone, right? Now, those are pretty suppressive, but they're so synergistic. We're going to use short-acting esters so that they clear out. And then in the last 2 weeks, we're going to use the attenuated androgens, anavar, masteron, right? So it'll be like a stepping down of suppression so that the HPG axis can come back online if it even gets shut down completely. So I'll give you basically a worked example for a test mass tren and anavar. In this case, test mass tren, anavar, yeah, that is no semblance of reliance on that, 19-nor test DHT model. I will tell you now why they are basically synergistic. And I've gone through this before on the forums, but let me just read it to you. So testosterone is an androst fluorine 3-one that is aromatizable and 5-alpha reducible. Testosterone increases both systemic IGF-1 via augmenting GH secretory burst mass, and it's increasing muscle IGF-1 isoform activity in the muscle cells. These increase muscle protein synthesis. Testosterone is 5-alpha amplified to DHT in CNS and gonadal tissues, allowing it to support sexual function. Testosterone is anti-catabolic by suppressing expression of muscle ring finger 1 and atrophin 1 mRNA, which decreases muscle protein breakdown, and suppresses expression of fibroblast growth factor inducible 14 and IL-6. These are the inflammatory responses to exercise. Okay, so whenever you hear something that is via a different pathway, right, that's going to synergize with another anabolic that acts on the same outcome, your muscle mass, right, when they are via different pathways. Trenbolone is a delta 4 9/11 free N. It's non-aromatizable and non-5-alpha reducible. Trenbolone decreases IGF-1 systemically by decreasing GH secretion, actually. It increases the satellite cell proliferative response to IGF-1. So it's doing more with less. It's also insulin sensitizing. It decreases blood glucose, and it exerts potent anti-glucocorticoid effects by decreasing GR number and suppressing corticosterone. Its anti-catabolic mechanisms are therefore going to result in decreasing muscle protein breakdown. Trenbolone particularly has anti-catabolic mechanisms as well as anti-adipogenic mechanisms. So it reduces fat mass as well as increasing muscle mass. And that really serves this objective here where somebody has to, within 8 weeks, recomp, decrease fat mass and increase fat-free mass. Trenbolone is particularly advantageous for this because it is so insulin sensitizing. It decreases PPAR gamma that controls formation of fat cells, fatty acid uptake, and insulin sensitivity. It decreases the differentiation of fat cell precursors. Basically, pre-fat cells are committed to a muscle lineage rather than a fat cell lineage. It also increases lipolysis and reduces lipid accumulation. Okay, so it does all of these things quite differently from testosterone, and therefore the two can be combined synergistically in a way that is 1 + 1 is greater than 2. Then we have Masteron. Masteron is a 5-alpha androstenedione that is non-aromatizable and non-5-alpha reducible. Its particularly unique property is its tissue-level modulation of estrogens. It prevents the uptake of estrogens into, for example, breast cells. In this, it's quite unlike SERM drugs. So people always say, oh, it's like basically a SERM, but it's really not. Like basically, SERMs antagonize estrogen receptors in the brain and the hypothalamus and pituitary. Masteron works at the tissue level, preventing estrogen uptake into cells directly. Besides this property, it is also, a relatively attenuated androgen and anabolic, and it just straightforwardly agonizes the AR. Anavar is also a 5-alpha androstenedione, non-aromatizable, non-5-alpha reducible. Its particularly unique property is its hepatic ketosis, right? It has a hepatic ketogenic mechanism that preferentially uses fat for fuel in the liver. This results in preferential reductions to central adiposity, the problematic fat depots in men, the love handles and abdominals. So in combination, this cycle results in a hardened physique with substantial fat loss. It's far greater than would be explained by increased metabolic costs of muscle. It results in substantial muscle gain with tissue-selective anti-estrogenic actions during caloric restriction or surplus, right? Test 5-alpha reduction to DHT provides for basal sexual function. Its increasing systemic IGF-1 provides for total body growth. Anti-catabolic effects are synergistic by working by different systems as trends and combines increased muscular and satellite cell responsiveness to IGF-1, doing more with less. Mass tissue level estrogen modulation, preventing uptake of estrogen into cells. Controls excessive aromatic product activity like estradiol from test. Anavar's hepatic ketogenic mechanism preferentially uses fat for fuel, reducing free fatty acids in circulation, reducing insulin resistance, and reducing lipid droplet content via esterification, uptake, and storage in fat cells. There's synergy between all of these features. Here's how we'll implement this cycle design for this 26-year-old male model who's prepping for his photo shoot in 8 weeks. Okay. So, weeks 1 through 6, we're going to use testosterone propionate. For example, 450 milligrams IM weekly to the moderate dose. You might split that up Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday. Use trenbolone, right? For example, 150 milligrams weekly. Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday again. These are short esters. Those are for the first 6 weeks. Okay, so in those first 6 weeks, we're going to use really potent synergistic drugs. Final 2 weeks, we're going to taper down in suppression, right? We're going to use masked propionate. We're going to use Anavar. So we might use drostanolone propionate, that's masked prop, at 150 milligrams weekly. And then we're going to use basically Anavar, Tuesday through Sunday, low dose, pretty low moderate dose. So basically we're going to start off moderate, go down to like low moderate with milder compounds. I'd like to go back basically and work through this process here. Give me just a second. Okay. So I'm going to go back and work through this process. Give me just a second. Is that still showing on the screen there? All right, so here we go. So I'm going to work back through from the first slide, essentially, right? So we're going to work back individualization for this male model, 26-year-old, 10% body fat, 25% fat-free mass index, which is above average muscularity, right? So to individualize in his case, we get this guy, right? He's got 8 weeks, not a long time, but he's already pretty lean. He's already pretty muscular. And so we just think, okay, compound selection and dose. We want to use some mild compounds. Okay. We don't want to use long-acting compounds. And he comes to us telling us the most important thing to him is he can't be suppressed. He's not going to blast and cruise. So we select compounds that are going to be synergistic to reduce the dose. It's going to give us an idea that we should be using something like test and trend for recomp, because he needs to recomp, basically lose fat and build muscle quickly without doing it in phases. He only has 8 weeks. So for risk tolerance, he's healthy, right? He's young. He's male. He's, advanced. He's not very advanced in his training status. He's the gym training since he was young. He has no familial cardiovascular disease history, which would be a big indicator against friend use, by the way, right? So talk about that. So he has no familial history of cardiovascular disease. His CVD risks are basically great, okay? He's male, 26 years old, less than 30. Training status, he already derives an income from his physique, right? He's got average or below CVD risk profile. And he definitely, with this guy, I'm thinking in terms of like, you're looking at bodybuilders, and most bodybuilders using androgens long term have like relatively bad lipids. This guy is going to be like a stellar health lipid wise compared to bodybuilders. I look at like, is this guy average for a bodybuilder who's using steroids long term, or is he, average, above average for that group? That's when we're talking about, something that's too risky, pushing somebody like that. Okay, so adherence to basic health self-monitoring guide. Like I told you, basically, this guy has been taking care of his health. He goes to his doctor. He does private blood work whenever he uses a cycle. This kind of guy, like a model, probably does like 2 cycles a year. 8-week cycles a year, maybe 3. Nothing crazy. So this is like kind of the case we're talking about here. All right. So for compound selection and dosing, remember, this guy's principal consideration is he is not going to blast and cruise, so he wants to be able to have his T production right back online if it even comes offline at any point. Okay. So, first thing, he's a male, so androgenicity. The reason we care about androgenicity for a male, I should say, is that is directly related to the suppressive effects. So androgenicity in women is masculinization. Androgenicity in men is like dysfunction to the HPG axis. It's like disrupting LH and FSH. Okay, it's the same underlying androgenicity is just masculinizing, and it's masculinizing in men, but we don't notice it because we're men. It's disruptive to our endogenous T production. It's also related to endogenous estrogen and progesterone production in women, androgenicity. Okay, and then his objective we know is to recomp. Right? So recomp, we definitely want to be using drugs like test and trend together. Trend just decreases fat mass and increases fat-free mass so potently. You can't use it alone. You have to use it with testosterone to have your, sexual function. And the two are so synergistic with IGF-1, what they do. Test increasing it, trend making more use of it in the muscle cell. And so you definitely want to be thinking about front-loading those 2 drugs. And that's what we're going to do. Risk tolerance is pull versus push factors. This guy has a lot of push factors. He doesn't have a lot of pull factors. He's a healthy young man who basically does a couple cycles a year. His initial dose, right? Training status. He's advanced, okay? His fat-free mass index is like 26, 25, 26. It's pretty good. It's just like, you could be that muscular without steroids. His fat-free mass index, is, like I said, and risk tolerance is, this guy can take a lot of risks, really. But he's not going to. He's not going to be willing to, but he can take more risks if he decided to switch to bodybuilding. Dose titration, for him, basically, we're just going to keep a low, moderate dose for everything. And we're just going to keep balancing efficacy versus tolerability. And he has a very time-bound objective, basically to recomp in 8 weeks. So we're going to keep balancing these two. This is what you're always doing when you're making decisions and selecting compounds and monitoring as well. So monitoring is like looking at their blood work changes over time. In this guy's case, you'd be looking at his blood pressure. You might want to do a baseline measure of his lipids, especially blood work parameters. You want to really, with toxicity, you should pay attention to symptoms, for example, like weakness. If he reports anything like looseness of stools, that's when you're thinking this guy is not handling the anavar well. You'd be thinking it's too toxic. You might even pull it out altogether. Some people don't handle anavar well. Even at low doses, they start having toxicity symptoms. It's not unheard of. Masculinization for him doesn't really matter. CVD parameters, they always matter. For him, though, he's got no familial history. His lipids are, it's more about time course, right? Like, what is the background? Like, this guy runs 3 cycles a year probably, right? For like 8 weeks, maybe 10. This guy, it's on a background of good health, good lipids most of the time. What matters is how long is he spending in dyslipidemia over the course of years, not how bad are his lipids while he's on an 8-week cycle, because it's all about the background lipid function. Like if it's over the course of years that he's doing a couple cycles, and even with tren, his lipids are going to be shit, but they're going to be shit for like 3 weeks, so it's okay. Blood work parameters that we'll look at lipids, especially, like I said. Anger, hostility, he's not going to have any real issues with this, but you should always pay attention. If he's just like an asshole, maybe with the first few weeks, 6 weeks, you want to pay attention with the trend and test. With appetite, hunger, and these aren't the most appetite boosting steroids, actually. So for him, fine. We're just always going to be one to balance things against his, decrease to fat mass, increase to fat-free mass, how strong he's getting, what his changes are like in the gym. Is he putting on a lot of strength and improving on his key lifts? His fertility and endogenous testosterone, especially for a man. We want to be paying attention to. We're not really going to measure his LH and FSH until after the cycle, right? But then after the cycle, you definitely want to see that things return to normal, that his FSH, LH, and T are back to normal. You might measure that, 6 weeks after the cycle has completed. And then miscellaneous sexual health. If he's reporting to you any issues with libido, be surprised, but it's possible. And then you might want to start adjusting, in his case, the testosterone. Maybe add proviron, very mild. Okay, so we're definitely going to be utilizing synergy. Okay, so back here. So you can see then working back, we're going to use those drugs, testosterone, okay, prambolone, synergistically. On the last 2 weeks of the cycle, we're going to step down and use Masprop and Anavar because they're so non-suppressive. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the female case. So the worked example for a female NPC wellness competitor, and she's a contender for a pro card within 4 months. She's 17% body fat. She wants to maintain a feminine physique, right? But muscular, but not excessively so. She's pretty muscular. She's about as muscular as the guy, 24.5 kg per meter squared FFMI. Not bodybuilder, so she's not like yoked out of her mind. 26 years old. She's already been competing on the circuit for a year. And her principal objective is going to be cutting. So she wants to reduce fat mass and really hold on to her muscle, or maybe even slightly eke out some increases in her muscle mass. And she's got a show in 16 weeks. So this gives us a little more time to work with. So her considerations, she's primarily concerned with preventing masculinizing effects. Okay, that's her first priority. She's willing to risk, but seeking to prevent infertility, right? So she wouldn't even use steroids if she was not willing to risk infertility. That's the first thing you want to bear in mind for female use with androgens. Okay, it's always a risk, just like for a man. It's always a risk to not have his endogenous T production come back online. For men, it's rare, exceedingly rare. For women, it would be more common to become infertile from androgens because the system is just so much less resilient to the male sex hormones. So we're going to use a moderately aggressive cut, near maximal maintenance of skeletal muscle. She still wants to have a feminine fat distribution. So she wants to be like, neither excessively conditioned nor excessively muscular. Her training and meal structure is going to be assumed to be optimal. We're going to be willing to deal with short-term fluid balance perturbations, like with the growth factors. And she just really cares about having final polish on stage. She doesn't mind going through some weeks where she's bloated and doesn't look great, so long as on stage in 4 months she looks great. And we're going to assume that the risk tolerance is rational, that she's not terrified or not crazy about risk taking. Okay, so practical design, the objective, she wants to decrease fat mass. We're going to optimize. These are when we're balancing efficacy and tolerability, her fertility, and her endogenous estrogen and progesterone production. So for compound selection and dosing, in this case, we would use non-androgenic drugs, okay, rimobolan, methanolone, enanthate. She already has experience with this, okay, so it's not like the first time we're introducing it. Anavar, okay, another attenuated androgen. We use mod-GRF 1 to 29 and ipamorelin, and we'll discuss why these are preferable for women, these GH secretagogues versus recombinant growth hormone. And as always, we're going to be leveraging synergistic combinations to reduce dose, area under the curve, and we're going to prefer shorter acting drugs if they're unaccustomed, and attenuated androgens for reducing the risk of masculinizing effects. All right. So here we have, this does refer to some proprietary materials, but I'll do everything I can to explain things well to you guys. So I'm going to give you a worked example for Anavar, Primo, mod-GRF 1 to 29, and ipamorelin. I'll tell you why these are going to combine synergistically for this female wellness competitor. So methanolone is an androst 1-ene-3-one, which is non-aromatizable and non-5-alpha reducible. That is an attenuated or with reduced masculinization and dysmenorrheic effects, meaning that it won't interrupt the menstrual cycle potently anyway. To some degree it will. This means that attenuated androgens really just minimally perturb the menstrual cycle and induce masculinizing effects. Methanolone as enanthate, which is rimobolan, provides a steady state of this dry anabolic with as frequent as once weekly intramuscular injection. It's, like Masteron or Stalolone, an anabolic foremost that prevents the uptake of estrogens into cells like breast tissue while reducing circulating estrogens, and is still used clinically for the treatment of metastatic breast cancer that is unresponsive to traditional treatment in some parts of the world, where its use is approved. Anavar oxandrolone is a 5-alpha androsten 3-one that is non-aromatizable and non-5-alpha reducible. And its particularly unique property, like we said, is that hepatic ketogenic mechanism. So it preferentially uses fat fuel in the liver. That will result in preferential reductions to fat mass. I'm going to use mod-GRF 1 to 29, or otherwise known as CJC 1295 without DAC. This is a GH secretagogue of the class known as GH-releasing hormone analogs, or GH-releasing hormones, GHRHs, and it is a GHRH receptor agonist. Ipamorelin is a GH secretagogue of the class known as GH-relin mimetics, GH-releasing peptides, or GHRPs, and is a GHS growth hormone secretagogue receptor agonist, GHSR agonist. These GH secretagogues combine synergistically to increase GH pulse amplitude, and in the case of the GHRP ipamorelin, that's what it does, as well as frequency of GH pulses. So in the case of GHRH or mod GRF 1 to 29 here, GH pulse amplitude refers to the absolute peak of GH secreted pulsatilely from the anterior pituitary, and GH pulse frequency refers to the number of pulses of GH secretions from the anterior pituitary. So both of these combine to increase GH area under the curve synergistically. GH itself is potently anti-catabolic. It's protein and calcium, phosphorus retentive, particularly in the extracellular compartment. So it affects not only the components of the intracellular compartment, but also the connective tissues. GH promotes recovery and slow wave stage 4 or 5 sleep. GH is potently fat mass reductive. It redistributes fat away from the central to the peripheral depots. So the reason that we prefer the GH secretagogues versus the recombinant RHGH is that women, given their high circulating endogenous estrogens, have elevated IGF-BP1. This is the IGF binding protein 1 that unleashes GH secretion by feedback withdrawal. Women have 1.5 times to greater than 3-fold greater GH levels than their size-matched male counterparts as a counterpart of this GH resistance that the IGF-BP1 exerts. So RHGH for women is relatively ineffective. Instead, the GH secretagogues are both more efficacious and tolerable for women. This is a result of estrogen enhancement on pituitary sensitivity to GHRH, so mod GRF 1 to 29 here. And estrogens increase GHSR number, the number of GH secretagogue receptors. That augments GHRP efficacy, for example here, ipamorelin. So these facts on the background of high GH due to feedback withdrawal by elevated IGF-BP1, the estrogen levels in women, and diminishing returns for exogenous GH, RHGH. These basically explain why the GH secretagogues are more efficacious and tolerable for women versus RHGH themselves, or for men even. So the cycle design that we will use here is going to rely on a cyclical pattern of AAS use to promote maintenance of menses. So we're going to be very careful with women. We're going to use androgens in 3-week blocks, take a week or 2 off, 2 weeks off, right, to allow the system to come back online if it was suppressed, which it will be at any amount, any dose, right? It's just their system, their HPG axis is more sensitive to male sex hormones than for men. So basically, we're going to orient 3 plus 2, right? So we're going to do like 3 weeks increasing dose and then, take 2 weeks off. We're going to do that like 3 times, and then we'll have a peak week at the last week for this 16-week cycle. Okay, so let's show you what we do. So here, I'll just give you the work product here. So weeks 1 through 6, right, in cycles of dosing on and then dosing off to promote menses. We'll use oxandrolone from a low dose. We'll start off at 2.5 milligrams orally every other day, and we'll go as high over the course of these 16 weeks to 15 milligrams every day of oxandrolone. Rimabole, we might start at like 35 milligrams weekly, and we might go up to as high as 135 milligrams weekly over the course of the 16 weeks. And remember, we're going we're going to use a pattern of 3 weeks of increasing from like 2.5 every other day up to 10 every other day or 7.5 every other day, gradually over time to 15 milligrams every day. If menses continues, if tolerability is good, if efficacy is good. So weeks 1 through 6, we'll use oxandrolone. No, sorry, that should say 1 to 16 weeks, 1 through 16 continuously. We're going to just throughout the whole cycle use the GH secretagogues. So let's go back and work through this using our steps. Make sure I get the right slide. Okay, so this woman, right? We know that her primary concerns are maintaining fertility and avoiding masculinization. So we're going to have to select compounds that are attenuated androgens, meaning non-masculinizing, non-androgenic relatively. We're going to use low doses, and we're going to titrate up very carefully. Risk tolerance, we'll talk about her push and pull factors. The dependencies for her push and pull factors for her risk tolerance are her age. So it's good that she's young. She's 26 years old. She's female. Okay, so that's a pull factor. Her training status is very advanced. She's been training since she was young, and we'll say she was a gymnast, right? All these wellness competitors usually have athletic backgrounds. Her body composition is she's got a little bit of body fat on her, but it's like healthy for a woman. She wants to maintain a feminine fat distribution, but she wants to put on a little bit of muscle and definitely lose fat and look well for wellness, right? She wants to look like an athlete. And then familial CVD history is fine, and she's a woman. That actually kind of helps a little bit in her cardiovascular disease risk. Okay, so for her pull factors, again, familial history of thromboembolic or fatal cardiovascular disease risks. For women, you might be concerned about like strokes in the family, because they do have a tendency to have thromboembolic events. Men usually have, fatal cardiovascular events, and that's probably basically because of testosterone. So for her, she does not have an elevated CVD risk profile, and she is female though, so that's going to pull her down, right? And it's going to pull her down pretty strongly. The female is going to be a huge pull factor, the fact that she's female. Push factors, she's young, that's good. Her training status is very advanced, and that's going to be a huge push factor, right? So that's going to be a huge push. The fact that she could, within this next 16 weeks, if it goes well, she could actually get a pro card. She has a great CVD risk profile. And she's been adhering to basic health self-monitoring guides. So basically, over time, she's been doing her blood work. She always looks at her blood pressure every morning. She's healthy and well. So for compound selection and dosing. So for her, we definitely, like we said, she cares about fertility. She cares about masculinization. So we cannot use anything like testosterone, nandrolone, anything highly androgenic. She'd never use trenbolone ever. Objective will be cutting. Okay, so we're going to use compounds that are primarily anti-catabolic, things like GH, especially, right? Things like Anavar that preferentially reduce fat, have unique hepatic ketogenic mechanism. Risk tolerance, basically, she's got a fair amount of push factors actually. But the fact that she's female is just weighed so heavily as a pull factor that she's got to be pretty careful with her dosing and her compound selection. So we're going to set her initial dose to be low, something like, 2.5 milligrams every other day of Anavar. For men, that sounds crazy, but that's what a woman should do because of those masculinizing effects, right? Her training status does call for maybe, dose titration, a little more aggressive. But for her initial dose, we'll set it at somewhere, depending on prior experience. This woman has never used Anavar before, so we're going to set it low. Fat-free mass index, right? It's pretty high for a woman, but not crazy. So we're going to set that moderate. Risk tolerance she'd be pretty risk prone. It would call for a lot of risk if we're not for the fact that she was a woman. Okay, and then dose titration. We'll titrate her dose up depending on tolerability. Maintenance of menses is going to be huge. Efficacy, we want to make sure we're getting good results, and that the objective show date, she can realistically, go pro, win the show at least. Okay, so the whole time we'll be monitoring masculinization. And the way that we would do that for a woman especially would be using like a voice pitch analyzer app. Voice pitch dysphonia is a rapid non-genomic effect, and there are these software tools that you can use to measure changes to your voice depth. You'd use something like that. That would be the primary indicator. This woman is not only concerned about masculinization, but also concerned about fertility, right? So we're just going to be pretty risk averse in her case because of these considerations, the fact that she just wants to do wellness. She doesn't want to be a bodybuilder, and she wants to have kids, but she would much rather be able to have kids than not. She cares, she's not giving up on another child. Blood work parameters for toxicity. you'd be measuring, you'd be a little bit concerned about the anavar, but not any more so than in men. It's just as dose dependent as in men, so it's lower doses, so it should be less of a risk. Anger, hostility, yeah, pay attention, but for women, it's usually fine. Low doses are not going to, with these compounds, they are not androgenic compounds, so really shouldn't have any of these issues. Appetite, hunger, these are not particularly appetite or hunger promoting. Her fertility and endogenous estrogen and progesterone, those are going to be the biggest things that she cares about. And that's why we're going to use that cyclical pattern of ramping up, over 3 weeks and then stepping back. So it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back over the course of like 3 of those cycles. And then she'll have a peak week as well. Okay. We're going to always rely on those. And again, we're going to use synergistic combinations. And like was discussed, these are synergistic. GH secretagogues, especially for women, are synergistic with androgens, better than GH. Men can ramp up their GH more aggressively and get more out of it because they don't have, that diminishing return. Women already have, 3-fold higher GH than their size matched male counterparts. So women are walking around with way higher GH than men. And we'll go back and just wrap it up now with talking again about this cycle for this woman, right? So this woman, she's going to be using oxandrolone. She's going to ramp up, first 3 weeks from like 2.5 milligrams up to something like 7.5 milligrams. And then eventually she'll reach like 15 milligrams by the end of, those 16 weeks daily even. Primo, she might ramp up from like 35 milligrams, but she's used the Primo before. She's never used the Anavar before. She's going to ramp up from like 35 milligrams up to 135 milligrams over like 16 weeks. This should read 1 to 16. Whole time, she'll use MOD-GRF 1 to 29, 100 milligrams. BID, SC-BID means subcutaneously twice in a day. So she's going to pin 100 micrograms, subcutaneously twice daily of MOD-GRF, and the same for the ipamorelin, up to 100 micrograms subcutaneously twice in a day. Those are very reasonable doses that would have the intended effect for a woman who is prepping for a wellness show in 16 weeks. All right, so that should wrap it up. Questions? Do you guys have any questions? I'd like to do a Q&A now. Okay. So, Mr. Uncle Bud said, you briefly mentioned that MAS directly agonizes AR. I often see guys claim that MAS has no anabolism. It's just a very mild anabolic. It does agonize AR. What makes it so mild is just like Primo, it's metabolized extensively by 3-alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, so 3-alpha HSD. It's expressed in human skeletal muscle, and it extensively metabolizes, or really it gets to exert any substantial anabolism. Basically, that It's broken down in the muscle before it really gets to exert effects. It's anabolic. It's just mildly anabolic. It looks better on paper than it is in practice with muscle building, but it builds muscle, especially in women. If you don't think it does anything, look at what it does in women. It's pretty potent. It's potent, and it's potent. It's not like test. Okay, so obium is why methanolone E and not methanolone A? So you mean primo ACE injectable? Because we want to use an injectable, and you can't inject ACE; you'll just be crippled. Um, that's the only reason. And basically, it's just like so expensive to run an effective dose of methylone acetate, primo ACE. Basically, you would have to you'd spend like $1,000 on the same on like 35 milligrams of IM. It would just be silly. Yeah, basically pain and price, right? Okay, so Rexy asks, was the inclusion of mast, when remember it was mast propionate, in the male's example simply for the lower androgenicity then, considering his goal of not being suppressed long term? Would it really have been much of an addition for anabolism to the test trend otherwise? Basically, that is the reason for the inclusion of mast, is because of its lower androgenicity. So it's basically like, think of it as post-cycle therapy in a way, right? It's like stepping down in androgenicity with a little bit of anabolism that agrees with men well, masteron, and it's to step down the androgenicity and maybe get a little bit of anabolism. That real first 6 weeks was the growth phase, recomp phase. Anyone else have any questions? Don't be afraid to speak up on the microphone either. Okay, so Mr. Uncle Buns asked, I've seen you reference the Hirschberger assay. I've seen a lot of commentary criticizing it as a source of good information. Do you use the assay just as a reference point in combination with other information? Or do you interpret it pretty directly? That's a good question. So the Hirschberger assay, first of all, it's not a source of good information. It's not even a source of information. It's an assay that was used a lot, and it was used, I think, pretty well clinically to develop and test steroids against. It is a measure supposedly of androgenicity versus anabolism. And the reason that it's very poor at doing this is it's in rats. And in rats, the ventral prostate and the levator ani are the two muscles that are looked at, right? The levator ani is a muscle supposedly that reflects skeletal muscle anabolism in man, and the ventral prostate androgenic growth in the prostate in man. It's a proxy, so you don't do human testing. But the levator NE is actually a sex organ in part. So it ends up in practice that testing against the Hirschberger assay doesn't really separate or distinguish properly between androgenic and anabolic effects. It's called the dorsal bulbocavernosus muscle. So it's not just purely skeletal muscle, it's also part of their sexual organs in rats. So it's just not good. It's basically what I don't even, I try to avoid it at all costs. I try to never refer to it. I don't even know how often I have. I mean, like if I do, it would be like where there's absolutely no other information, and I'll just be like, oh, and by the way, this is like 10,000 times more anabolic than like this or something. You know what I mean? It's like on the Hirschberg assay, but like I don't use it. Like I just like try to use human data. I basically avoid using HA data. I've criticized it widely myself. Um, no, good question. OVM MDS, no, not so. OVM MDS asks any other secretagogues worth using besides the ones you mentioned. Um, Not really. I'm thinking. So maybe yes. So GHRP6 or hexarelin, right? You could use that to really boost appetite. And then butamorin, which is MK677, really boosts sleep. So maybe those two actually. Yeah, so I would say those four: MOD-GRF1 to 29, ipamorelin, and then ibutamorin, which is MK677 to promote sleep and the appetite. But GHRP6 is, I would use that above ibutamorin or MK677. Um, nice thing about the ibutamorin or MK677 is that it's like easy. It's widely available. It's basically like it's like a supplement, you know. So if you have to travel, you might use it. You know, so you don't have to travel with like, you know, injectable drugs. It's an oral, you know, you just swallow it. So those four, those four. Oh, Hootman. So, oh, you're talking about Hootman's bioluminescence data? So, Mr. Uncle Bun said, I messed up the question there, not the Hirschberger assay. I was thinking of a study done by Hootman, but I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, so it was he had a method for testing cellular interaction. Yeah, so Mr. Uncle Bun, so it was bioluminescence data that was used. Um, I can describe to you how that works. So it was something like the AR-Calyx method. Calyx is a proprietary method where bioluminescence is used, and what that is basically the enzyme that lightning bugs or fireflies have that makes them light up. So they use that, and they put that a uh, into the steroid receptor. Right? They grow a mammalian steroid receptor, and then they use this bioluminescence. It's escaping me now what it's called, but it's an enzyme that lights up. And what they do is activation that drug causes in mammalian androgen receptor lights up, and they can measure the relative light units of the activation potency per compound. And so you've seen that criticized? Who would criticize that? I would love to hear the context of somebody saying that that's not like valid. Because it's like the most valid method you could ever conceive of. So I'd like to hear their counter argument for why you wouldn't put any stock in that method. It's just forum talk. Yeah. I don't know, man. Can't really answer. Basically, the gold standard method. Um, okay, guys, I'll wrap it up if nobody else has any other questions. Let's give it another 5 minutes. I'll give you guys 5 minutes. Do you have anything else? It seems like that's it. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for coming. This was great. I'll put out, I did record this. It looks like it was good. So I'm going to put out a recording of this later, and I'll try to make the slides available to people as well. You're very welcome, guys. Thank you for coming. All right, I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.